My name is Nia, and I am 34 years old. I arrived at the airport to begin a 3-day business trip to Monaco, only to spot my husband and my best friend checking in for a romantic vacation I knew nothing about. As I quietly followed them through the terminal, a shocking truth began to unravel, exposing a betrayal far deeper and more painful than I had ever imagined. What they did not know was that they had just handed a loaded gun to a financial auditor who controlled every single aspect of their wealthy lifestyle. Before I share how I burned their perfect little world to the ground, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain while plotting the ultimate revenge against people who underestimated you. Growing up, I was taught that Black excellence meant working twice as hard to get half as far. I took that lesson to heart. I built my career as a senior wealth manager and financial auditor from the ground up, fighting for every promotion in corporate spaces that were not designed for me to succeed. I married DeAndre, a commercial real estate broker who loved the spotlight. We were the picture-perfect couple at our local church, the HBCU alumni success story that everyone in our community admired. We drove the right cars, wore the right clothes, and attended all the right charity galas. But behind the designer suits and the bright Sunday morning smiles, the reality of my marriage was quietly suffocating. My mother-in-law Shirley made sure of that. Shirley was a prominent force on the church board, a woman who wore elaborate hats and quoted scripture while effortlessly tearing people down. Just last Sunday, at our weekly family dinner, Shirley looked at me across the dining table and loudly complained that DeAndre looked exhausted. She stated that a highly successful Black man needs a wife who stays home and nurtures his spirit, not a human calculator who flies across the world for client meetings. She constantly reminded everyone that DeAndre needed a son to carry on the family legacy, heavily implying that my intense focus on my career was the sole reason my womb remained empty. DeAndre just sat there eating his food, letting his mother disrespect me in my own dining room. I swallowed my pride that afternoon, telling myself that his recent emotional distance and stress were simply due to his massive upcoming commercial property deals in Chicago. That brings me to Tuesday morning at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. My flight to Monaco had been delayed by 3 hours due to severe weather over the Atlantic. I was sitting in the first-class lounge sipping sparkling water and reviewing high-net-worth client portfolios on my laptop. Feeling stiff from sitting, I decided to stretch my legs and grab a coffee from a specific cafe in the international terminal. The airport was a massive sea of moving bodies, luggage wheels, rolling over polished floors, and overhead announcements blending into a chaotic roar. I was looking down at my phone, drafting an email to my legal team, when a very familiar laugh cut straight through the noise. The laugh belonged to Chloe Jenkins. Chloe and I had pledged the same sorority in college. We wore the same colors, stepped on the same yards, and swore to be sisters for life. She was my maid of honor, the woman who adjusted my veil and held my dress while I married DeAndre 10 years ago. Chloe was always the sweet, bubbly one in our circle, the girl who masked her deep-rooted insecurities with overly enthusiastic compliments. Over the years, I had wiped away her tears when broke boyfriends broke her heart, and I even leveraged my corporate connections to help her secure her first public relations job. Recently, she had been incredibly distant, claiming she was overwhelmed with work and spending all her free time nursing her sick grandmother out of town. I looked up toward the international check-in desks. There, standing in the priority lane for a flight to Paris, was Chloe. And standing right behind her with his arms wrapped tightly around her waist was my husband. DeAndre was supposed to be boarding a domestic flight to Chicago for a 3-day real estate conference. He had kissed me goodbye that morning at 4 o'clock, looking me right in the eyes, telling me he loved me, and promising to call as soon as he landed in the freezing Midwest. Yet here he was in the international terminal wearing a casual linen shirt and a very expensive pair of sunglasses I had bought for his birthday last month. I froze completely. The breath left my lungs. I stepped behind a massive structural concrete pillar, hiding myself from their line of sight. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I thought my chest might crack open. I watched them interact. They were not just standing together as friends. They were draped over one another, displaying the comfortable, effortless intimacy of a couple who had been doing this for a very long time. DeAndre leaned down and kissed her neck. Chloe giggled, a sound that made my stomach churn, and leaned back against his chest. Then the absolute worst moment happened. DeAndre moved his hand from her waist and placed it gently on her stomach. He rubbed it in slow, circular, protective motions. Chloe placed her hand over his, looking up at him with pure adoration. Her stomach was slightly rounded, beneath her fitted designer travel dress. The ultimate betrayal hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. Chloe was pregnant. My husband and my best friend were having a baby together. I did not scream. I did not run over to the ticketing counter and cause a public scene. Crying and begging for answers would only give them power, and I absolutely refused to be the angry, hysterical woman creating a spectacle for strangers to record on their cell phones. In my line of work, when you discover a massive discrepancy in the financial ledger, you do not immediately confront the embezzler. You gather your evidence. You quietly build an airtight case until the trap is perfectly set, and then you strike when they have nowhere left to run. Numbers do not lie, and neither does behavior. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were shaking slightly, but my mind was operating with ice-cold clarity. I opened my message thread with DeAndre. I typed a simple, cheerful message. "Hope Chicago is productive, babe." I hit send. I stood perfectly still behind the concrete pillar and watched my husband. Less than 10 seconds later, I saw him pull his phone from his pocket. He looked at the screen, smiled to himself, and quickly typed a response with one hand while keeping his other arm securely around Chloe. My phone buzzed in my hand. His message read, "Just checked into the hotel. It is freezing here. Miss you so much, beautiful." A wave of physical nausea washed over me. He lied with such terrifying, practiced ease. While his arms were wrapped around his pregnant mistress, he was flawlessly maintaining the grand illusion of our perfect marriage. I immediately opened a new message thread. This time I texted Chloe. "Hey girl, want to grab brunch this weekend when I get back from my trip, miss you." I looked up and watched Chloe's designer purse vibrate. She pulled out her phone, read my message, and actually showed the screen to DeAndre. They both laughed. DeAndre kissed her cheek while she typed her reply. My phone buzzed again. Chloe's message read, "I wish I could still nursing my sick grandma out of town. She is doing a bit better, but I need to stay by her side. Let us definitely catch up next week. Have a safe flight." The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. My husband and my sorority sister were casually laughing at my expense, completely comfortable in the toxic web of deceit they had spun around me. I lifted my phone and zoomed the camera lens in on them. I took several high-resolution photos of them kissing, of him holding her stomach, of the luggage tags that clearly showed their destination was Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. Every picture was a nail in the coffin of my marriage. Every photo was hard evidence I would use to absolutely destroy them. I lowered my phone and took one last look at the man I had loved and supported for 10 years. The grief was definitely there, sharp and agonizing, but it was being rapidly swallowed by a cold, calculating rage. I turned around and walked away from the international terminal. I pulled up my airline application and canceled my flight to Monaco with a single tap. I called my assistant and instructed her to switch all my overseas meetings to virtual conferences, citing a sudden family emergency. I did not drive back to our beautiful, heavily mortgaged house in the suburbs. Instead, I walked out of the airport, got into my car, and drove straight toward DeAndre's commercial real estate office in downtown Atlanta. DeAndre was flashy, arrogant, and notoriously careless with legal details. He had always relied on me to manage the complex financial structures of his business because he found the numbers boring. He had given me full administrative access to his private servers years ago, which was a fatal mistake for a man with something to hide. While he was flying across the ocean to play house with my best friend, I was going to log into his network, tear his financial world apart, and find exactly where the money for this lavish Parisian getaway was coming from. The hunt had officially begun. The drive from Hartsfield-Jackson to DeAndre's downtown office was a blur of Atlanta traffic and sharp focus. I bypassed the receptionist with a familiar wave. She knew me as the boss's wife, the woman who handled the firm's major financial compliance. DeAndre's office was a monument to his ego. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city custom leather furniture, and framed magazine articles featuring his real estate victories. Victories I had mathematically engineered for him behind the scenes. I locked his heavy mahogany door and sat in his expensive executive chair. I opened his desktop computer. DeAndre was a man of habit and vanity. His passwords were embarrassingly predictable, usually combinations of his fraternity founding year and his own birth date. I was in his private server within 30 seconds. In my profession as a financial auditor, we have a saying: the money always leaves a trail. People can lie with their words, their tears, and their smiles, but bank ledgers are brutally honest. I did not waste time looking for hidden photo folders or romantic emails. I went straight to the lifeblood of his operation: the financial statements. I opened the master file for our joint high-yield savings account. We had built that account over 8 years, heavily funded by my corporate bonuses intended for our future children and long-term investments. According to the monthly summary DeAndre had casually shown me last week, the balance was sitting healthily at $500,000. But when I bypassed his local files and logged directly into the bank portal using his master credentials, the true balance loaded on the screen. $300,000, $200,000 was completely gone. Bypassing the initial shock, my auditor instincts took over. My husband had not just withdrawn the money, he had systematically siphoned it out in increments of $25,000 and $50,000 over the past 6 months to avoid triggering fraud alerts with our bank. He had then downloaded the official bank statements, altered the PDF documents to show the original balances, and saved the forged copies on our home network for me to see. It was sloppy, arrogant, and insulting to my intelligence. He actually believed a few altered PDFs could fool a senior wealth manager. I sat perfectly still, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. The grief I felt at the airport was completely gone now. You can mourn a cheating husband, but you destroy a thief. I needed to know exactly where my money went. I pulled the routing numbers from the withdrawal history and began tracing the digital footprints. The funds had not gone to a hotel in Paris or a secret credit card. They had been wired into a corporate business account under the name Apex Consulting Limited. I opened a new tab and ran a quick search through the Georgia Secretary of State Business Registry. I typed in the LLC name and waited for the registered agent details to populate. When the results flashed on the screen, a cold, bitter laugh escaped my throat. The registered owner of Apex Consulting Limited was Terrence Washington, DeAndre's older brother. My brother-in-law Terrence was a man who wore tailored suits to church but could barely afford to put gas in his leased Mercedes. He and his wife LaToya were notorious in our family for living miles beyond their means. Terrence was always pitching some new brilliant business idea at our Sunday family cookouts, trying to get investors for ventures that never actually materialized. I had personally paid their overdue electricity bill twice last year, just to keep LaToya from crying at the dinner table. And here he was acting as the bagman for my husband's infidelity. The betrayal deepened, wrapping its toxic roots around my entire extended family. Terrence knew. Terrence was actively helping DeAndre hide assets from me. I leaned back in the chair and thought about the family barbecue we had hosted at my house just 3 weeks ago. Terrence had hugged me, eaten the food I bought and prepared, and loudly praised me to the pastor as the best sister-in-law a man could ask for. Meanwhile, he was laundering my hard-earned money through a fake consulting firm to fund his brother's secret life. The sheer audacity made my blood run cold. They thought I was just a blind, submissive wife who would keep financing their fake black excellence lifestyle while they played me for a fool. But I was not done digging. A shell company is just a transit point. I needed the final destination. I hacked deeper into the shared corporate network DeAndre and Terrence sometimes used for their joint real estate ventures. It took me 45 minutes of cracking encrypted folders and cross-referencing wire transfers, but I finally breached Terrence's outbound ledger. Terrence had held the $200,000 in his LLC account for exactly 3 days. Then he initiated a massive single-wire transfer to a title and escrow company located in the affluent Buckhead district. I knew this title company. They handled luxury residential closings. I pulled up the escrow receipt and the finalized bill of sale attached to the transaction. My eyes scanned down the legal document past the property address, past the real estate agent fees, until I hit the buyer information. The property was a luxury 3-bedroom penthouse condo. The sole registered owner was Chloe Jenkins. I read the name 3 times, letting the reality of the words burn themselves into my brain. They bought her a house. DeAndre and Terrence had taken $200,000 of my money, funneled it through a fake business, and used it as a massive cash down payment on a luxury condo for my best friend. They were building a nest for her and the baby she was carrying, entirely funded by my corporate bonuses. I closed my eyes and pictured Chloe sitting in my living room last month, sipping wine I paid for, looking me right in the eye, and complaining about how hard it was to find a good man. I pictured her crying on my shoulder about her awful landlord and how desperately she wanted to become a homeowner. I had actually offered to sit down with her and help her build a financial plan to save for a mortgage. All the while she was sleeping with my husband and living in a luxury penthouse that I had unknowingly purchased for her. I downloaded every single document. The forged bank statements, the wire transfer logs, the LLC registration proving Terrence's involvement, and the finalized deed to Chloe's condo. I compiled everything into a secure encrypted folder and sent it directly to my personal offshore cloud server. They had gotten careless because they thought they had already won. DeAndre thought he had outsmarted me by using his brother as a shield. Chloe thought she had secured her bag and her future by getting pregnant. They thought I would eventually find out about the cheating cry file for a standard divorce and walk away quietly to protect my own professional reputation. They severely miscalculated the kind of woman they were dealing with. I wiped my digital footprints from DeAndre's desktop, leaving the computer exactly as I had found it. I locked his office door behind me and walked out of the building into the warm Atlanta afternoon. The sun was shining brightly, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire marriage and family structure had just been exposed as a massive criminal fraud. My phone buzzed in my purse. It was a text message from my mother-in-law, Shirley. She was reminding me about the upcoming family dinner on Sunday. "Make sure you bring that special peach cobbler DeAndre loves, Naya. We need to keep our men happy and fed," she wrote, adding a simple heart. I stared at the message. Terrence knew. Chloe knew, DeAndre knew, and knowing Shirley with her controlling grip on her sons and her desperate desire for a grandchild, it was highly likely she knew exactly what was going on as well. The whole family was an echo chamber of betrayal, a syndicate of leeches surviving off my success while plotting my downfall behind my back. I got into my car, gripped the steering wheel, and let out a single sharp laugh. I was not going to cry. I was not going to confront DeAndre when he returned from his fake Chicago trip. I was going to play the role of the perfect, oblivious, loving wife. I was going to smile at Sunday dinner. I was going to bake Shirley's favorite cobbler. And while they were eating my food and laughing behind my back, I was going to meticulously orchestrate a legal and financial bloodbath that would strip every single one of them of their money, their homes, and their freedom. I pulled out of the parking lot and dialed the only person I could trust right now. The phone rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered. "Elias," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I need a shark. We have federal wire fraud and I am ready to burn it all down." Elias Thorne was not just a lawyer. He was a legal predator who specialized in white-collar crime and asset recovery. We had crossed paths a few years ago during a corporate merger where I was the lead auditor. I respected his ruthlessness, and he respected my meticulous attention to detail. When I told him we had federal wire fraud, I knew he would drop whatever he was doing to take the case. The word federal changes everything in the legal world. It takes a simple domestic dispute and elevates it to a mandatory prison sentence. "I need you to meet me at my private office in an hour," I told Elias over the phone, navigating through the heavy downtown traffic. "I have the ledgers, I have the wire receipts." My husband and his brother just used an SBA-affiliated corporate account to launder $200,000 to buy a luxury property for a pregnant mistress. I could practically hear Elias smiling through the phone. "A pregnant mistress and federal money laundering," he replied, his voice dripping with professional excitement. "Nia, you always bring me the most fascinating puzzles. Bring hard copies of everything. We are going to lock this down so tightly they will not even be able to buy a cup of coffee without our permission." I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. The sheer stupidity of DeAndre's actions was staggering. In his desperate attempt to play the big shot provider for Chloe, he had exposed himself and his brother to federal jurisdiction. He had used a business account that received federal funding assistance to hide personal funds. The IRS and the federal government do not play games when it comes to business fraud. DeAndre had practically handed me the key to his own jail cell. As I drove closer to my own office, I began mapping out the timeline in my head. I had 3 days before DeAndre and Chloe returned from Paris. 3 days to solidify my legal strategy, move my remaining personal assets into impenetrable accounts, and prepare my mask. When DeAndre walked through the front door of our home, he had to believe he was returning to a woman who suspected absolutely nothing. He had to feel completely safe and secure in his deception. I parked my car and took a deep breath. The air felt different now. The heavy burden of trying to be the perfect wife for a family that secretly despised me was gone. In its place was a sharp, unyielding purpose. They wanted to use me as their personal bank. They wanted to steal my wealth to fund their betrayal. I was going to show them exactly what happens when you try to con a senior wealth manager. I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The game had completely changed. DeAndre and Chloe thought they were playing checkers, moving pieces around in secret, hoping to crown themselves the winners of my life. But they were entirely unaware that I had just flipped the board and turned the game into high-stakes chess. And in chess, the queen is always the most dangerous piece on the board. I walked into the glass doors of my office building, my head held high. It was time to go to work. The conference room in Elias Thorne's firm was as cold and calculating as the man himself. I dropped the heavy manila folder onto the center of his massive glass desk. The sound echoed in the quiet room, carrying the weight of a 10-year marriage that had just been exposed as a synchronized communal grift. Elias did not offer empty sympathies or pitying glances. He was a predator in a tailored suit, and he knew exactly what I was bringing him: blood in the water. He opened the folder, and his eyes scanned the printed wire transfers, the forged bank statements, and the deed to Chloe's luxury condo. I watched his mind work, processing the numbers with the same ruthless efficiency that made him the most feared white-collar crime attorney in Atlanta. When he reached the document showing Terrence's LLC routing the funds, Elias leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "You were right," Elias said, his voice a low, smooth baritone. "Terrence registered this LLC using a federal Small Business Administration loan meant for minority community development. By moving your marital assets through this specific account to purchase private real estate for a third party, your husband and his brother have crossed a very dangerous line. This is not just marital asset dissipation, Nia. This is federal wire fraud. It is embezzlement. It is money laundering. If the IRS and the FBI catch wind of this, they are looking at mandatory federal prison time." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the reality of his words. "Good," I replied, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. "I want them to feel every single consequence. I want them stripped down to the studs. But before we file anything, I need to make absolutely sure they cannot hide any more assets. DeAndre is sloppy, but Terrence is a hustler. He might have physical copies of the escrow documents or secondary tax forms stashed somewhere safe." Elias nodded in agreement. "DeAndre is using a secondary mailing address for his private real estate dealings to bypass your home mailbox. We need to know if any hard copies of the Parisian hotel bookings or the condo closing documents were mailed there. Do you know where he sends his shadow mail?" I did not even have to think about it. Yes, he sends it to his mother's house. Shirley Washington lived in a pristine 2-story brick home in the upscale Cascade neighborhood. Her house was a monument to her carefully curated image as the ultimate church matriarch. She hosted Bible studies, led the women's ministry, and practically demanded that the entire community view her family as the pinnacle of Black excellence. DeAndre had always used her address for his fraternity mail and what he called private investment documents. I had never questioned it before, assuming it was just a harmless boundary he kept to feel independent. Now I understood it was a drop site for his illicit activities. I left Elias's office with a clear directive: gather the physical evidence without leaving a single trace. I drove through the affluent tree-lined streets of Cascade, my hands gripping the steering wheel with absolute precision. The Georgia afternoon heat was sweltering, but inside my chest everything was freezing over. I pulled up a block away from Shirley's house and parked my car under the shade of a large oak tree. I grabbed my designer sunglasses and the spare key Shirley had given me years ago for emergencies. Walking up the manicured driveway, I noted that Shirley's silver Lexus and Latoya's leased Range Rover were both parked in the garage. Latoya was Terrence's wife, a woman who spent thousands of dollars trying to look wealthy, while her credit cards were constantly maxed out. She and Shirley were incredibly close, mostly because Latoya knew exactly how to play the submissive, flattering daughter-in-law role that Shirley demanded. I, on the other hand, intimidated them. I made my own money, paid my own bills, and never needed Shirley's permission to live my life. I quietly slipped this key into the front door lock and turned it. The heavy oak door swung open without a sound. The house smelled intensely of pound cake and collard greens, a deceptive, comforting aroma that completely masked the toxic reality of the people living inside. I stepped into the grand foyer and gently pushed the door shut behind me, making sure the latch clicked silently into place. I moved toward the antique console table in the hallway, where Shirley always kept the sorted mail. My eyes quickly scanned the envelopes. There were several bank statements addressed to Terrence's LLC and a thick envelope from the exact Buckhead Title Company that had handled the closing for Chloe's condo. My heart beat in a steady, measured rhythm. I pulled out my phone to photograph the return addresses and account numbers, knowing better than to steal the physical mail and alert them to my presence. As the camera shutter clicked silently, the sound of laughter drifted down the hallway from the kitchen. It was high-pitched, grating, and incredibly familiar. Latoya and Shirley were drinking wine and gossiping in the middle of the afternoon. I froze, my finger hovering over my phone screen. I had every intention of walking right back out the front door, but then I heard my own name. I crept silently down the plush carpeted hallway, stopping just behind the archway that led into the massive sunlit kitchen. I held my breath, pressing my back against the wall, remaining completely hidden in the shadows. "Latoya, make sure the nursery in Chloe's new condo is painted sage green," Shirley said, her voice dripping with absolute satisfaction. "DeAndre finally has a son coming. That is what he gets for marrying a human calculator like Nia, who cares more about her spreadsheets than giving me a grandbaby." The words hit me like a physical strike, but I did not gasp. I did not flinch. I just stood there, letting the sheer magnitude of the betrayal wash over my entire being. Latoya let out a loud, obnoxious cackle. "I already told Chloe I know a great interior decorator," Latoya replied, the clinking of her wine glass echoing in the kitchen. "But Chloe said DeAndre gave her a strict budget for the furniture. Can you believe Nia is literally funding the whole thing and does not even know it?" Terrence said DeAndre was sweating bullets transferring that 200 grand. Shirley scoffed dismissively. "Oh, please. Nia has more money than she knows what to do with. She is too busy flying around playing the big corporate boss to even notice. Besides, DeAndre deserves a woman who actually respects him as the head of the household. Chloe is a sweet girl. She knows how to cater to a man. Nia walks around here acting like she is better than everyone else just because she works on Wall Street. It is unnatural for a woman to be that ambitious. She brought this on herself. They were all in on it. The entire family. For 10 years, I had paid for Shirley's lavish Mother's Day vacations. I had quietly covered the deficit when Terrence's brilliant business ideas crashed and burned so Latoya would not lose her leased luxury car. I had sat in the front pew of their church holding DeAndre's hand, smiling for their family photos and functioning as the financial backbone of their entire existence. And in return, they had welcomed my cheating husband's pregnant mistress into their fold. They had actively coordinated to steal my life savings to buy her a home. Shirley, the woman who prayed over my meals and called me her blessed daughter, was picking out paint colors for a baby my husband conceived with my best friend. Latoya, who constantly begged me for financial advice, was mocking me while drinking wine bought with my money. DeAndre is a genius for putting the condo in Chloe's name. LaToya continued, her voice thick with jealousy and greed. Terrence told me that once the baby is born, DeAndre is going to ask Nia to invest in a fake commercial property flip. They are going to use that money to set up a college fund for the boy. Nia will just write the check like she always does. A college fund. They were plotting to steal even more of my money to raise Chloe's child. The psychological depth of their parasitism was absolutely staggering. They viewed me not as a human being, not as a family member, but as a bank account with a pulse. A resource to be drained to fund the life they believed they were entitled to. I did not shed a single tear. Crying implies heartbreak, and you can only be heartbroken by people you still love. In that narrow hallway, listening to them orchestrate my financial ruin, while laughing at my dedication to my career, whatever love I had left for DeAndre and his family evaporated completely. It burned away, leaving nothing but pure, unadulterated ice. I took one final, perfectly clear photograph of the title company envelope on the console table. I placed the mail back exactly where I found it, ensuring the edges aligned perfectly with the other envelopes. I turned around and walked back to the front door. My footsteps were completely silent against the hardwood floor. I slipped out of the house, pulled the heavy door shut until it clicked softly, and locked it with my spare key. The sweltering Georgia heat hit me as I walked back to my car, but I felt absolutely nothing. I was numb in the most dangerous, powerful way possible. I got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and locked the doors. The quiet hum of the air conditioning filled the car. I pulled my phone from my purse and stared at the screen. I scrolled past DeAndre's fake, loving text messages from Chicago. I scrolled past Chloe's lying messages about her sick grandmother. I scrolled past Shirley's sweet reminders about Sunday dinner. I was entirely surrounded by monsters wearing the faces of the people I trusted most. I pressed Elias Thorne's contact name and put the phone to my ear. He answered on the first ring, his professional tone cutting through the silence of my car. "I have the confirmation," I said, my voice completely devoid of warmth. "I found the escrow mail at Shirley's house. But Elias, the situation has escalated." "What did you find?" Elias asked, his tone shifting into absolute predatory focus. "They all know," I replied, staring blankly at Shirley's perfectly manicured lawn through my windshield. "The entire family is complicit. My mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, my husband, and my brother-in-law are all actively conspiring to launder my assets to fund this child. They are planning a second massive theft disguised as a real estate investment to secure a college fund for the mistress's baby." I heard Elias exhale sharply through the phone. "Naya, if the family is conspiring to commit further financial fraud using federal loan accounts, we are no longer just looking at a divorce settlement. We are looking at a racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization structure. We can seize everything." "Good," I said, shifting my car into drive. "Elias, I need a shark. We have wire fraud and I want a massacre. I want you to draft the blind trust documents for my house immediately. I want Terrence's corporate accounts flagged for federal auditing. And I want the IRS notified about the Parisian wire transfers." "Consider it done," Elias replied. "We will let them play their little game until the anniversary party. When do you want to drop the hammer?" "When they feel the safest," I promised, gripping the steering wheel. "I am going to bake my mother-in-law's favorite cobbler. I am going to kiss my husband when he gets back from his romantic getaway. And then I am going to watch the federal government strip them of their freedom, their homes, and their precious public image. Start the paperwork." I hung up the phone and drove away from Cascade. The perfect, successful, oblivious Nia Washington was officially dead. The woman driving back to the city was a financial executioner, and her family was completely unaware that they were already standing on the gallows. I bypassed my own suite on the 20th floor and took the private executive elevator straight up to the legal department. Elias Thorne was already waiting for me in his conference room. The massive glass table was completely covered with blown-up financial flowcharts, bank routing documents, and printed screenshots of Terrence's corporate filings. Elias stood at the head of the table. His suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He looked like a surgeon preparing to perform a highly invasive, meticulously planned operation. He did not offer a greeting. He just pointed a sleek silver pen at a red circle drawn heavily on the central flowchart. We have a massive problem, Nia. And by problem, I mean a beautiful, catastrophic federal nightmare for your husband and his brother. Elias tapped the paper sharply. I dug into the origins of Terrence's consulting firm. Apex Consulting Limited was not just a regular shell company. 6 months ago, Terrence applied for and received a highly monitored federal Small Business Administration loan. It was a specific government grant program designed to inject capital into struggling minority-owned businesses in underprivileged Atlanta neighborhoods. I walked slowly to the table, my eyes scanning the heavily highlighted documents. Terrence got federal funding. I asked, feeling a cold, sharp thrill radiate through my chest. He used an SBA loan to fund a luxury condo in Buckhead for a mistress. Elias smiled, a terrifying, predatory expression that completely transformed his face. Exactly. The $200,000 your husband stole from your joint savings was routed directly into this SBA-funded account to mix with the federal grant money. It is a classic, albeit incredibly sloppy, commingling of assets. Terrence used the federal funds to inflate his business valuation, and DeAndre used Terrence's account to wash the stolen marital assets. Then they wired a massive lump sum from that federally monitored account straight to the Buckhead Title Company. And to make matters worse, some of the overflow funds were wired to an international bank in Paris to cover their little romantic getaway. Elias leaned across the glass table, his dark eyes locking onto mine. Naya funneling federal business development money across international borders and using it to buy luxury private real estate is not just marital infidelity. It is a direct violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 1343. It is federal wire fraud. It is embezzlement of government funds. The IRS and the FBI absolutely love cases like this. When federal prosecutors see two wealthy, arrogant men using minority community development funds to buy luxury penthouses for their pregnant mistresses, they do not just offer plea deals. They make extremely public, highly punitive examples out of them. They are looking at a mandatory minimum of 10 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I stood there in the quiet conference room, the sheer magnitude of their stupidity washing over me. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so utterly convinced of their untouchable status in the community, that they had practically gift-wrapped their own federal indictments. I do not just want a divorce, Elias, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unwavering whisper. A divorce implies an equitable splitting of assets. A divorce means DeAndre gets to walk away with half of the portfolio I built, play the victim at church, and live happily ever after with his new family. I do not want an equitable split. I want them stripped of everything. I want the cars. I want the retirement accounts. I want Terrence's business dismantled. And most importantly, I want my house. Elias picked up his pen and began drawing sharp, decisive lines across a blank notepad. If we want to strip him bare before the feds freeze all the assets we have to execute a silent shift, we need him to legally sign away his rights to the marital home and assume sole legal liability for the SBA loan before the indictment drops. We need to create an airtight legal snare. For the next 4 hours, Elias and I sat in that conference room and engineered a financial death trap disguised as a golden opportunity. I instructed Elias to quietly establish an offshore blind trust under the name Horizon Holdings LLC, an entity completely disconnected from my personal identity. Next, we drafted a massive, highly complex commercial real estate syndicate agreement. DeAndre possessed a massive ego, but had absolutely zero patience for reading complex financial contracts. He always relied on me to summarize the details for him. We buried his financial execution deep within a 90-page document. On page 42, buried under a mountain of dense legal jargon regarding asset reallocation, was a clause where DeAndre voluntarily relinquished his entire equity stake in our marital home, transferring sole ownership to Horizon Holdings, LLC. On page 68, framed as a corporate leadership initiative, was a clause making DeAndre the primary legal guarantor for Apex Consulting Limited, tying him directly to Terrence's fraudulent SBA loan. If he signs this, Elias said carefully, Binding the thick stack of papers into a premium leather portfolio, he effectively sells your house to your blind trust and handcuffs himself to a sinking federal ship. But how are you going to get him to sign a 90-page legal document without having his own lawyers review it first? I took the leather portfolio from Elias's hands, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of it. By feeding his ego, I replied smoothly, DeAndre is obsessed with being the smartest, most successful black man in the room. If I package his own destruction as a massive promotion, he will sign it without reading a single word. 3 days later, I was standing in the immaculate marble-floored kitchen of our home. The house smelled faintly of roasted garlic rosemary and the expensive red wine I was letting breathe on the granite island. I was wearing a tailored silk dress, my hair perfectly styled, playing the role of the devoted, successful, supportive wife to absolute perfection. The heavy oak front door swung open, and DeAndre walked in. He dropped his leather duffel bag in the foyer and let out a loud, exaggerated groan of exhaustion. He was wearing the exact same linen shirt I had seen him wearing at the airport in Atlanta, but he had thrown a heavy jacket over it to sell the illusion of the freezing Midwest weather. He walked into the kitchen, his face breaking into a wide, brilliant smile that showcased his perfectly white teeth. God, it is good to be home, he said, wrapping his arms tightly around my waist and pulling me against his chest. He kissed me passionately. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I leaned into the kiss, smiling flawlessly against his lips, even though I could smell the distinct lingering scent of Chloe's expensive Parisian perfume mixed into the fabric of his shirt. He smelled like my best friend luxury hotel sheets and bold, unapologetic lies. Chicago was absolutely brutal, babe. DeAndre sighed, pulling back to look at me with weary, practiced eyes. The real estate market up there is a war zone right now. I spent 12 hours a day locked in conference rooms fighting over zoning permits. I barely had time to eat, let alone shop, but I managed to grab you a little something at the airport. He reached into his jacket pocket and proudly placed a cheap plastic snow globe on the granite island. Inside the globe was a miniature replica of the Willis Tower, surrounded by fake glittering snow. I looked at the $10 trinket he had undoubtedly asked Terrence to buy at an airport gift shop and hold for him. He had spent $200,000 of my money to buy Chloe a luxury penthouse in Buckhead, and he had brought his wife of 10 years a piece of plastic. It is beautiful, I said, my voice dripping with warm, manufactured affection. Thank you, sweetheart. I know how hard you work for us. Sit down. I poured you a glass of your favorite Cabernet. DeAndre eagerly took a seat at the kitchen island, loosening his tie and taking a deep sip of the wine. He looked around the pristine kitchen, utterly satisfied with himself. He believed he had won. He believed he was the master of his universe, successfully juggling a brilliant corporate wife who paid the bills and a pregnant mistress waiting for him in a luxury condo. I walked around the island and picked up the heavy leather portfolio Elias had prepared. I placed it gently on the granite countertop right next to his glass of wine. What is this? DeAndre asked, his eyebrows raising in curiosity as he ran a hand over the premium leather. I smiled, letting my eyes shine with bright, artificial excitement. I am launching a new wealth fund, babe. I have been working on it with the executive team all week. It is a massive commercial real estate syndicate targeting high-level development zones across the city. The capital projections are enormous, and we need a heavy hitter to act as the primary legal signatory to close the major deals. DeAndre's posture immediately changed. He sat up straighter, his chest puffing out slightly. His ego was already expanding, filling the kitchen with its toxic, predictable weight. "You want me to be the primary signatory?" he asked, a greedy gleam appearing in his eyes. I leaned forward, resting my hands gently on his shoulders. "Of course I do. You are the best commercial broker in Atlanta. Having your name at the top of this syndicate will solidify your reputation. I need you to lead this. It will make you look like a king to the church board and the community. Everyone will know exactly who DeAndre Washington is." I opened the portfolio to the final page, exposing a row of bright yellow signature tabs placed meticulously next to the dotted lines. I handed him a heavy gold fountain pen. DeAndre did not even glance at the preceding 89 pages. He did not ask about the liability clauses, the asset transfer agreements, or the federal SBA loan guarantee hidden in the dense legal text. He was completely mesmerized by the sound of the word king. He took the pen, gave me a cocky, self-assured wink, and quickly signed his name across every single yellow tab, unwittingly signing away his home, his wealth, and his freedom in less than 30 seconds. I smoothly slid the heavy leather portfolio out of his reach the exact second the ink dried on the final page. I closed the cover with a soft, definitive thud sealing his fate inside. DeAndre leaned back against the kitchen island, rolling his shoulders and letting out a deep, self-important sigh. He picked up his glass of Cabernet and swirled the dark liquid, admiring his own reflection in the kitchen window. "You know, Nia, I am really glad you finally brought this to me," he said, his voice thick with unearned arrogance. "I have been telling you for years that you take on too much stress. You are a smart woman, but this high-level commercial syndicate stuff requires a different kind of vision. It takes a real man to shoulder this kind of corporate liability. You need to learn how to fall back and let your husband lead the family empire." The sheer audacity of his gaslighting was almost poetic. He was standing in a kitchen I paid for, drinking wine I bought, lecturing me about financial leadership right after secretly using federal grant money to buy a condo for his pregnant mistress. He was utterly convinced that he was the mastermind of our relationship. "You are absolutely right, babe," I replied, keeping my voice soft, submissive, and perfectly modulated. "I have been trying to control everything for too long. It is exhausting. Knowing that you are officially taking full legal responsibility for these new ventures lifts a massive weight off my shoulders. I feel so much safer with you in charge." DeAndre smiled, deeply satisfied by my manufactured submission. He reached out and stroked my cheek, a gesture that made my skin crawl. "That is my girl. Just focus on looking beautiful and keeping this house running. I will handle the heavy lifting from now on." I took the leather portfolio and walked it straight to my home office. I locked it inside my fireproof safe. DeAndre had just unwittingly chained himself to a sinking federal ship and handed the keys to my marital home over to an untouchable offshore blind trust. The legal snare was tightly secured. Now I just had to keep him comfortable until the trap snapped shut. The next afternoon was Sunday, which meant mandatory attendance at Shirley Washington's weekly family dinner. Walking into my mother-in-law's house was always an exercise in psychological warfare, but today I was armed with a completely different mindset. I carried a freshly baked peach cobbler in my hands, wearing a modest, conservative floral dress that I knew Shirley would approve of. DeAndre walked in ahead of me, carrying himself like a conquering king. The house smelled intensely of roasted chicken, candied yams, and baked macaroni and cheese. The dining room table was already set with Shirley's expensive fine china and polished silver. Terrence and LaToya were sitting in the formal living room when we arrived. Terrence was wearing a custom-tailored suit and a flashy gold watch that I knew for a fact was purchased using the stolen funds from our joint account. LaToya was draped in a silk designer dress, her hair freshly styled, holding a crystal glass of sweet tea. They looked like the ultimate power couple, broadcasting an image of immense wealth while secretly functioning as absolute parasites. "Look who finally decided to show up," Terrence boomed, standing up to give DeAndre a complicated fraternal handshake. "The man of the hour. How was Chicago, little brother? You close that zoning deal?" DeAndre let out a tired, dramatic laugh. "Man, it was a bloodbath. The wind coming off Lake Michigan was freezing, and the city council fought me on every single permit. But you know I never leave a table without securing the bag." Terrence laughed loudly, clapping DeAndre on the back. "That is what I am talking about. Black excellence, brother, always securing the future." I stood in the entryway holding my cobbler, watching them exchange their rehearsed masculine banter. They were looking right into each other's eyes, speaking in coded language. Terrence asking about Chicago was his way of asking how the Parisian getaway with Chloe went. DeAndre confirming he secured the bag was his way of confirming that Chloe's luxury condo closing went off without a hitch. The absolute sickness of their shared deception was suffocating, but I maintained a bright, oblivious smile. Shirley swept into the room wearing a sharp-tailored church suit, her hair sprayed perfectly into place. She bypassed me entirely and walked straight to DeAndre, grabbing his face and kissing both of his cheeks. "My handsome boy," Shirley cooed, fixing his collar. "You work entirely too hard. Look at the dark circles under your eyes. The Lord knows you need a proper rest. She finally turned her gaze toward me, her eyes sweeping up and down my floral dress with mild disdain. Nia put that cobbler in the kitchen. I hope you did not burn the crust this time. DeAndre needs a proper home-cooked meal after flying across the country, not something hastily thrown together between your endless corporate phone calls. I will make sure it is perfect. Mother Shirley, I replied cheerfully. I walked into the kitchen, set the dessert down, and took a deep, centering breath. The performance had to be flawless. We gathered around the long mahogany dining table. Shirley sat at the head, claiming her position as the undisputed matriarch. DeAndre sat on her right, Terrence on her left. Latoya and I sat across from each other. Before anyone picked up a fork, Shirley demanded we join hands for grace. She prayed for 10 minutes, loudly thanking God for the prosperity of her sons and asking the Lord to grant wisdom to the wives who needed to learn their proper submissive place in the household. As the food was passed around, Latoya immediately launched her first attack. She cut into a piece of roasted chicken and looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile. So Nia Latoya began, her voice loud enough to ensure the entire table was listening. Are you still working those crazy 80-hour weeks? I just do not know how you do it. I could never leave my husband alone that much. Terrence relies on me to manage his peace of mind. A man needs to feel like a man when he comes home, not like a roommate passing you in the hallway. Terrence nodded proudly, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. Latoya is the backbone of my consulting firm. She keeps the home fires burning so I can focus on expanding Apex Consulting into international markets. International markets. He was openly bragging about laundering federal money across the Atlantic Ocean to Paris. The arrogance was blinding. Shirley chimed in, pointing her fork directly at me. Latoya is exactly right. The Bible clearly states that a wise woman builds her house, but a foolish one tears it down with her own hands. You have been married to my son for 10 years, Nia. 10 years. And what do you have to show for it? A fancy job title and an empty nursery? You are failing your most basic duties as a wife. DeAndre is building an empire, and you are too selfish to give him a son to inherit it. DeAndre looked down at his plate, playing the role of the silent, long-suffering husband. He did not defend me. He let his mother publicly humiliate my fertility, knowing full well that he was biologically sterile and that his mistress was carrying another man's baby. I looked around the table at the four of them. They were feeding off my silent humiliation, drawing strength from my perceived weakness. It was time to give them exactly what they wanted. You are absolutely right, Mother Shirley, I said, lowering my head and keeping my voice soft and remarkably steady. I have been failing. I have been so consumed with climbing the corporate ladder that I completely lost sight of my real priorities. I have not been the wife DeAndre deserves. The dining room went completely silent. Latoya paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. Shirley's eyes widened in genuine shock. I had never agreed with them before. I had always fiercely defended my career and my independence. My sudden total submission caught them completely off guard. I looked up at DeAndre, letting my eyes shine with manufactured devotion. You have been carrying so much weight, babe. Building your business, dealing with stressful trips to Chicago, securing our financial future. I have been blind to how much you sacrifice for us. But that stops today. I am making major changes. I promise you DeAndre is about to get exactly what he deserves. DeAndre puffed out his chest, a wide, triumphant grin spreading across his face. He reached over and patted my hand. It takes a big woman to admit her faults, Nia. I appreciate you saying that. We are going to get things back on track. Shirley beamed, absolutely delighted by my public capitulation. She clapped her hands together, the heavy gold rings on her fingers clinking sharply. Well, praise the Lord. It seems the Holy Spirit has finally softened your hardened heart, Nia. This is exactly what I have been praying for. Shirley reached for her crystal glass of sweet tea and tapped it lightly with her butter knife. Since we are finally functioning as a proper united family, I have a major announcement to make. She looked at DeAndre, her eyes shining with intense maternal pride. Next weekend marks your 10th wedding anniversary. 10 years of marriage is a massive milestone in our community. I have decided that we are going to throw a massive lavish anniversary gala to celebrate. We are going to host it at the Piedmont Country Club. I want a live jazz band, an ice sculpture, a 5-course catered dinner, and professional photographers. Latoya gasped in excitement, clapping her hands. Oh my goodness, yes. We need to invite everyone. Shirley nodded emphatically. We are inviting Pastor Williams, the church elders, the mayor's office, DeAndre's entire fraternity chapter, and all the prominent business leaders in Atlanta. I want to show this city what true Black excellence looks like. I want everyone to see the powerful, unbroken legacy of the Washington family. Shirley turned her sharp gaze back to me, the familiar demanding edge returning to her voice. Of course, since this is a celebration of your marriage, I expect you to handle the financial arrangements, Nia. I have already drafted a preliminary guest list of 200 people. The country club requires a substantial deposit by tomorrow morning to secure the grand ballroom. They wanted me to pay for a massive, highly publicized party to celebrate a fraudulent marriage, while the groom was busy settling his pregnant mistress into a luxury condo bought with my stolen money. It was the ultimate insult, the pinnacle of their financial parasitism. I did not hesitate. I reached into my designer handbag, pulled out my leather-bound checkbook, and placed it on the dining table. I would be absolutely honored to fund the entire event, Mother Shirley, I said, smiling so brightly my cheeks ached. In fact, do not worry about a budget. Spare no expense. Upgrade the floral arrangements, book the premium open bar, and make sure the photographers are the best in the city. I want this anniversary party to be a night that this family will remember for the rest of their lives. Shirley smiled, deeply satisfied that her human ATM had resumed its normal function. Excellent. I will call the country club coordinator in the morning. Latoya, you can help me pick out the table linens. I sat back in my chair and took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. They were entirely focused on the ice sculptures and the guest list. They had no idea that I had just eagerly agreed to finance their public execution. I was going to pack 200 of their most respected friends, colleagues, and church members into a single enclosed room. And then, I was going to let the federal government kick the doors off the hinges. The final week leading up to the anniversary gala was a masterclass in psychological endurance. DeAndre was in high spirits, constantly kissing my cheek and bragging to anyone who would listen about the massive event his successful wife was throwing for him. Shirley and Latoya practically moved into my house, treating it as their personal event planning headquarters. They ordered expensive floral arrangements, debated the merits of live jazz versus a DJ, and drank my wine while criticizing my lack of enthusiasm. I floated through my own home like a ghost, writing checks, smiling pleasantly, and mentally calculating exactly how many days they had left before the federal government seized everything they owned. The absolute pinnacle of their collective audacity arrived on Saturday afternoon, precisely 24 hours before the gala. The doorbell rang. I opened the heavy oak door to find Chloe Jenkins standing on my front porch. Chloe was wearing a loose-fitting emerald green maxi dress that expertly concealed the slight rounding of her stomach. She held a massive bouquet of white lilies, my favorite flowers, and wore a bright, incredibly fake smile that stretched tight across her perfectly contoured face. "Happy early anniversary, bestie," Chloe squealed, throwing her arms around me in a tight, suffocating hug. The scent of her expensive Parisian perfume hit my nose, the exact same perfume I had smelled on DeAndre's shirt when he returned from his fake Chicago trip. I hugged her back, my hands resting lightly against her spine. "Thank you, Chloe. It is so good to see you. How is your sick grandmother doing?" I asked, my voice dripping with honey. Chloe pulled back her face, instantly morphing into an expression of deep, manufactured sorrow. "Oh, she is hanging in there. It has been so stressful flying back and forth to take care of her, but family comes first, right? I just could not miss helping my favorite sorority sister get ready for her big day." "You are too sweet," I replied, stepping aside to let her into my home. The home she and my husband were actively planning to steal from me. Chloe walked into the living room, immediately greeted by Shirley and Latoya, who were sitting on the expensive white sectional sofa. The dynamic between the three of them was instantly noticeable. Latoya smiled broadly, patting the cushion next to her to invite Chloe to sit. Shirley looked at Chloe with a warmth and affection she had never not once directed toward me. Shirley actually reached out and gently patted Chloe's knee, her eyes briefly dropping to Chloe's stomach before darting away. "Nia, honey, go pour Chloe a drink," Shirley commanded, not looking at me. She has been dealing with so much family stress. She needs to relax. I walked to the custom bar cart in the corner of the dining room. I picked up a heavy crystal coupe glass and opened a bottle of vintage champagne. I poured the bubbling gold liquid, measuring every movement, maintaining absolute control over my breathing. I walked back into the living room and extended the glass toward Chloe. "Here you go." "The good stuff," I said, offering her a brilliant smile. Chloe looked at the champagne, her eyes flashing with a split second of panic. She placed a hand protectively over her stomach, a subtle, arrogant gesture she had been repeating ever since she walked through the door. "Oh no, thank you, Nia," Chloe said, waving the glass away with a delicate laugh. "I am actually on a very strict detox right now. Just water for me." A detox. She was sitting in my living room, pregnant with my husband's child, lying to my face about a juice cleanse. "Of course," I replied smoothly, setting the crystal glass down on the coffee table. "You look absolutely incredible, Chloe. You are practically glowing." Chloe blushed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thank you. I have just been really focusing on my health lately. Preparing for the future, you know." Latoya snickered softly, taking a long sip of her wine. "Well, you are definitely glowing, girl. You look like a woman who just secured a very bright future." They were openly mocking me in my own living room. They felt completely invincible. I sat down in the armchair across from them, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly in my lap. "So, Nia," Chloe said, leaning forward slightly, 10 years. That is a massive milestone. What is the secret? How do you keep DeAndre so happy?" I looked directly into Chloe's eyes. "The secret is trust, Chloe. Absolute, unwavering trust. DeAndre handles the heavy lifting, and I just make sure all the numbers balance at the end of the day. He knows I would never let anything bad happen to this family without thoroughly planning for it first." Chloe smiled, completely missing the threat hidden in my words. "That is so sweet. He is a lucky man." DeAndre walked into the living room at that exact moment, freshly showered and wearing a crisp white polo shirt. He stopped short when he saw Chloe sitting on the sofa next to his mother. For a brief, terrifying second, I saw raw panic flash across his face. He quickly masked it, pasting on his signature arrogant grin. "Chloe," DeAndre said, his voice a little too loud, a little too enthusiastic. "What a surprise. Good to see you." DeAndre, Chloe replied, her voice dropping an octave, becoming softer, more intimate. "I just had to come by and congratulate you two. 10 years is an incredible achievement." DeAndre walked over and stood behind my chair, resting his hands heavily on my shoulders. I felt the heat of his palms through the silk of my dress. He was marking his territory, playing the role of the devoted husband for the audience. "It has been a wild ride," DeAndre said, squeezing my shoulders, "but I would not want to do it with anyone else. Nia is the foundation of this empire." Shirley rolled her eyes, annoyed by her son's public display of affection for me. "Well, the foundation is important, but a man needs a legacy," Shirley said sharply. 10 years is a long time to wait for a legacy, Nia. "The Lord blesses those who prioritize family over worldly ambitions." DeAndre stiffened slightly behind me. "Mom, let us not do this today. We are celebrating." I reached up and gently patted DeAndre's hand. "It is okay, babe. Mother Shirley is right. A legacy is the most important thing a man can build. And I promise you, by tomorrow night, everyone in Atlanta will know exactly what kind of legacy you have created." The room fell quiet. The heavy, suffocating weight of their collective deception pressed against the walls. They thought they were the architects of my destruction. They thought they were holding all the cards. I smiled at Chloe, who was looking at me with a mixture of confusion and smug superiority. I smiled at Shirley, who was glaring at me with open disdain. I smiled at Latoya, who was busy refilling her wineglass. I was sitting in a room full of dead people. They just did not know they had stopped breathing yet. My phone buzzed sharply in my lap. The screen lit up with a secure text message from Elias Thorne. I picked up the phone, excusing myself from the conversation with a polite nod. I walked into the kitchen, leaning against the cool granite countertop, and opened the encrypted message. The text was brief, clinical, and absolutely devastating. The IRS has officially finalized the audit on Apex Consulting Limited. The federal wire fraud investigation has been escalated to a multi-agency task force. The Buckhead condo has been flagged for immediate asset forfeiture. Warrants have been signed by a federal judge. The hammer drops tomorrow. I read the message twice, feeling a cold electric surge of pure adrenaline race through my veins. The trap was fully primed. The federal government was heavily armed and ready to obliterate my husband's entire existence. I typed a quick response to Elias. "See you at the country club. Wear a nice suit." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked back into the living room. Chloe was laughing at something DeAndre had said, her hand resting delicately on her stomach. Shirley was beaming at them, the proud matriarch, overseeing her son's expanding fraudulent empire. I sat back down in my armchair, perfectly composed. I looked at the three women who had actively conspired to steal my wealth, and the husband who had casually traded my loyalty for a cheap Parisian affair. "I hope everyone is ready for tomorrow night," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the quiet room. "I have prepared a very special presentation for the anniversary gala. I want to show the entire community exactly what DeAndre has been doing behind the scenes. It is going to be unforgettable." DeAndre beamed, his ego inflating to massive proportions. "I cannot wait, babe. You always know how to put on a show." Chloe smiled, sipping her water. "I will definitely be in the front row for that." I looked at my pregnant best friend and gave her a slow, predatory smile. "I know you will be, Chloe. I guarantee it." The Piedmont Country Club was a fortress of southern wealth, a sprawling estate of manicured golf courses and towering marble columns. Tonight, the grand ballroom had been transformed into a temple of absolute arrogance, entirely funded by my checkbook. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 50 round tables draped in heavy ivory silk. At the center of the room stood the massive ice sculpture Shirley had demanded, a glittering swan, slowly melting into a silver basin. A six-piece jazz band played softly in the corner, setting a sophisticated tone that completely masked the criminal decay beneath the surface. I stood near the entrance in a custom-tailored crimson gown, playing the gracious hostess. I shook hands, air-kissed cheeks, and accepted endless congratulations from the elite of Atlanta. The room was packed with over 200 people. DeAndre had invited every single commercial real estate developer he wanted to impress, filling the tables with potential investors who believed he was a legitimate business titan. His fraternity brothers were there in full force, wearing their colors, loudly swapping college stories and slapping DeAndre on the back. My mother-in-law Shirley held court near the head table like a reigning monarch. She wore a deep purple evening gown and an elaborate fascinator hat, soaking up the admiration of the church elders. I watched her smile benevolently as Pastor Williams approached her, shaking her hand and praising her for raising such an upstanding, successful son. LaToya and Terrence were working the room nearby. Terrence was aggressively networking, handing out sleek black business cards for Apex Consulting, Limited, the very same shell company currently under federal investigation for wire fraud. He was literally passing out evidence of his own crimes to high-net-worth individuals while drinking top-shelf bourbon I had paid for. LaToya trailed behind him, showing off a new diamond tennis bracelet, blissfully unaware that her leased luxury SUV was about to become her permanent residence. DeAndre was in his element. He moved through the crowd with a magnetic, practiced charisma. He laughed loudly at jokes that were not funny, flashed his perfect teeth, and pulled me into his side whenever a photographer approached. He was the picture of black excellence, the devoted husband celebrating a decade of marital success. Every time he kissed my temple for the cameras, I had to suppress the urge to wipe my skin. At precisely 8 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open and Chloe Jenkins made her entrance. She had completely abandoned the modest, oversized dresses she had been wearing to hide her pregnancy. Tonight, Chloe wore a stunning, form-fitting champagne silk gown that clung to every curve of her body, deliberately highlighting the distinct, undeniable rounding of her stomach. She walked into the ballroom with the arrogant, entitled posture of a woman who believed she had already won the ultimate prize. She was not just a guest tonight. She believed she was the incoming queen surveying the kingdom she was about to inherit. Chloe bypassed the peripheral tables and walked straight to the front of the room, claiming a seat at a VIP table directly adjacent to the main stage. Shirley saw her sit down and offered a warm, approving nod. DeAndre caught Chloe's eye from across the room and gave her a subtle, reassuring wink before turning back to shake hands with a city councilman. I stood at the edge of the dance floor watching this silent, sickening exchange. They were so incredibly bold. They felt so safe in my presence that they were openly communicating their betrayal right in front of me, confident that I was too busy managing the catering staff to notice. The heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom opened one more time. Elias Thorne walked in. He did not mingle. He did not grab a drink. Elias wore a sharp charcoal gray suit, looking entirely out of place among the festive celebrating crowd. He moved with the quiet, lethal grace of a predator entering an enclosure. He found a spot near the back wall, leaning against a marble pillar, crossing his arms over his chest. He caught my eye across the massive ballroom and gave me a single, barely perceptible nod. The federal task force was in position. The perimeter was completely locked down. Nobody was leaving this country club tonight. The jazz band concluded their set and the event coordinator tapped a spoon against a crystal glass, signaling the guests to take their seats. The low murmur of hundreds of conversations slowly died down as the attendees settled in. DeAndre grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly, and led me up the short flight of carpeted stairs to the elevated main stage. A spotlight hit us blindingly bright. DeAndre stepped up to the polished acrylic podium, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease. The room erupted into applause. His fraternity brothers stood up and cheered loudly, while the church elders clapped with dignified approval. DeAndre raised his hands, gesturing for the room to quiet down. He offered a wide, brilliant smile that reached every corner of the grand ballroom. "Thank you," he began, his voice booming smoothly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Thank you all for being here tonight. When I look out into this room, I do not just see friends and colleagues. I see family. I see the community that raised me, the men who mentored me, and the church that kept me grounded." He paused, letting the words resonate. Pastor Williams nodded in the front row, clearly moved by the performance. 10 years ago, DeAndre continued, his tone shifting into something deep and reverent. "I stood at an altar and made a promise to God and to the most incredible woman I have ever known." DeAndre turned to look at me. He reached out and gently took my hand, pulling me closer to the podium. The spotlight shifted, catching the glimmer of the diamond ring he had placed on my finger a decade ago. "Nia," he said, looking deeply into my eyes with a manufactured sincerity that made my stomach turn. "You have been my rock. You have been the quiet strength behind every deal I have closed, every property I have developed, and every success I have achieved. When I was building my empire, you were the foundation that kept me steady. The world sees the suits, the cars, and the victories. But they do not see the late nights, the sacrifices, and the unwavering loyalty of the queen standing beside me." The room let out a collective, audible sigh of adoration. I looked down at the front row. Shirley was dabbing at the corner of her eye with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the deeply moved mother. Next to her, Chloe sat perfectly still, a smug, knowing smirk playing on her lips. Chloe was looking at DeAndre with an expression of pure possession, entirely convinced that this entire speech was a temporary formality before he filed for divorce and moved her into the spotlight. DeAndre turned back to the crowd, raising his voice to a triumphant crescendo. "They say behind every great man is a great woman, but I say beside every king is a queen who ensures the crown never slips. I love you, Nia. Here is to 10 years of building an unbreakable legacy and to the brilliant future we have ahead of us." The ballroom erupted into a standing ovation. People were cheering, whistling, and raising their glasses in a toast. DeAndre pulled me into a tight embrace, kissing me deeply for the photographers who had rushed to the front of the stage. Flashbulbs went off in rapid succession, capturing the ultimate image of a successful, loving, powerful couple. He pulled back, his eyes shining with absolute triumph, and handed me the microphone. He stepped aside, giving me the floor, fully expecting me to deliver a tearful, submissive speech, thanking him for his incredible leadership. The applause slowly died down as I stepped up to the acrylic podium. I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw Pastor Williams smiling encouragingly. I saw Terence raising his glass of bourbon. I saw Shirley looking at me with her usual critical glare, waiting for me to say the right words to make her son look good. And I saw Chloe, her hands resting deliberately on her stomach, waiting for me to finish my little speech so she could have her man back. I gripped the edges of the podium. The microphone picked up the steady, calm rhythm of my breathing. "Thank you, DeAndre," I said, my voice ringing out crystal clear, entirely devoid of the emotional tremor everyone expected. That was a beautiful speech. It truly was a masterpiece of fiction. The smiles in the front row faltered slightly. Pastor Williams lowered his glass. DeAndre shifted his weight behind me, letting out a small, confused, nervous laugh, thinking I was attempting a dry joke. 10 years is a long time. I continued my gaze, locking directly onto Chloe in the front row. It is a decade of trust, of shared bank accounts, of late nights, and supposedly of building a legacy. My husband just spoke very eloquently about the empire he has been building. He talked about foundations, about sacrifice, and about the truth behind the public image. I turned my head slightly, catching Elias Thorne's eye at the back of the room. Elias gave me a cold, sharp nod. The doors were secured. The trap was locked. "But DeAndre is right about one thing," I said, turning my attention back to the massive crowd. "The world only sees the suits, the cars, and the public victories. They do not see what happens in the shadows. They do not see the real cost of this particular brand of Black excellence. And tonight, since we are all gathered here as family and community, I decided it was time to stop hiding the truth." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a small black remote control. I held it up so the entire room could see it. I prepared a special video. I announced, my voice dropping to a sharp, commanding pitch that echoed off the high ceiling of the ballroom. "I want to show exactly what my husband has been building behind the scenes." I pressed play. The massive digital projector mounted high above the ballroom flared to life. The heavy velvet curtains behind the stage parted automatically, revealing a massive theater-sized screen that spanned 20 feet across the wall. The bright white light of the projector cut through the dim ambiance of the country club, illuminating the shocked, expectant faces of the 200 guests. I stepped away from the podium and walked to the edge of the stage, standing directly above Chloe Jenkins. She was no longer smirking. Her hands had dropped from her stomach and she was gripping the edges of the table, her knuckles turning white. Shirley was staring at the blank white screen, her brow furrowed in deep, sudden panic. Terence had stopped networking, his glass of bourbon frozen halfway to his mouth. DeAndre stepped toward me, his voice a frantic, hushed whisper, meant only for my ears. "Nia, what is this? What video? Did you hire a videographer?" I did not look at him. I kept my eyes completely locked on the massive screen behind us. "Just watch the legacy you built, DeAndre," I whispered back, my voice colder than the ice sculpture melting in the center of the room. "Enjoy the premiere." The screen flickered, the crisp, high-definition resolution snapping into focus. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum, waiting for the first frame of the video to drop. The illusion of the perfect Washington family was currently suspended by a single fraying thread, and I had just taken a pair of sharp steel scissors directly to it. The show was finally starting. The screen illuminated the dark ballroom with brutal, unforgiving clarity. The first image was not a carefully curated montage of our wedding day or a slideshow of our romantic vacations. It was the raw, unedited footage I had captured on my phone at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. The towering 20-foot display showed DeAndre wearing the exact same expensive sunglasses I had bought him, wrapping his arms around Chloe at the international check-in desk. The resolution was flawless. Every single detail of their betrayal was magnified for the entire room to witness. The camera zoomed in tight as DeAndre leaned down and passionately kissed my best friend. The crowd could see the unmistakable way her hands draped around his neck, displaying a level of comfort that only comes from months of deceit. The video then cut to the most damning angle of all. DeAndre sliding his hand down to rest squarely on Chloe's visibly rounded stomach, rubbing it with a sickeningly familiar affection while they laughed together. I had not stopped there. I am a financial auditor and my presentations are always built on undeniable proof. The video dissolved from the airport footage into a stark, perfectly formatted presentation of hard financial data. Giant, crisp images of bank ledgers appeared on the screen, towering over the head table. The entire audience watched as the balance of our joint high-yield savings account was displayed, followed by the exact systematic withdrawals of $25,000 and $50,000. Bright red arrows, animated for dramatic effect, traced the stolen $200,000 directly into the corporate account of Apex Consulting Limited. Terrence's name was plastered across the screen in bold, undeniable letters as the registered agent of the shell company. The red arrows continued their relentless march across the screen, connecting Terrence's federal loan account to a wire transfer receipt. The final document faded into view, casting a bright white glow over the horrified guests. It was the official warranty deed for a luxury penthouse condo in the Buckhead district. The purchase price was highlighted in neon yellow, matching the exact amount stolen from my marital savings. And right there on the line designating the sole owner of the property was the name Chloe Jenkins. I had turned my financial audit into a public execution, complete with visual aids. The presentation looped starting back at the airport kiss, ensuring that anyone who had blinked the first time would not miss a single frame of the betrayal. The reaction in the Piedmont Country Club was not just a gasp. It was a physical shockwave that rippled through the grand ballroom. 200 prominent guests, church elders, politicians, and business leaders inhaled sharply at the exact same moment. The silence that followed the initial gasp was deafening, a heavy, suffocating vacuum of absolute disbelief. Then the chaos erupted. The ambient jazz music had stopped entirely, the band members staring open-mouthed at the screen. Pastor Williams, the moral compass of Shirley's meticulously curated social circle, literally dropped his silver fork onto his china plate. The sharp clatter of metal against porcelain echoed loudly near the front table. DeAndre's fraternity brothers, who had just been cheering and raising their glasses to his supposed black excellence, suddenly found the floor incredibly interesting. Some shifted uncomfortably in their tailored suits, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The women from Shirley's church ministries began whispering frantically behind their hands, casting disgusted, horrified glances toward the front row where Chloe was sitting. Terrence stood frozen near the bar, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he realized his federal business account was being broadcast to the entire room. LaToya, who had been showing off her diamond tennis bracelet just moments before, accidentally dropped her wineglass, shattering it across the polished hardwood floor. The pristine, untouchable image of the Washington family empire was being dismantled brick by brick, broadcast in high definition for the entire city elite to consume. DeAndre stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his perfect, arrogant smile completely wiped from his face. The rich, warm tone of his skin drained away, leaving him looking hollow and terrified. He stared at the massive screen, watching himself kiss Chloe on a continuous loop. His brain struggled to process the reality that his secret life had just been weaponized against him by the very woman he thought he had successfully manipulated. When the shock finally wore off, sheer unadulterated panic set in. He lunged toward the podium, his hands grasping wildly at the electronic controls, desperately trying to find a power button or a switch to shut off the projector. But the projector was mounted high in the vaulted ceiling of the ballroom, controlled exclusively by the remote resting securely in my hand. He could not reach it. He could not stop it. DeAndre whipped around to face me, his eyes wide with wild, unfiltered desperation. He abandoned all pretense of dignity, professionalism, and power. He rushed across the stage, grabbing my arm with trembling, sweaty hands. "Nia, turn this off," he pleaded, his voice cracking entirely, forgetting that his lapel microphone was still active and broadcasting his frantic begging to the entire room. "Nia, please. You have to shut it down. This is a misunderstanding. She means nothing to me." His words echoed through the massive speakers, carrying over the loud whispers of the crowd. "She means nothing to me." I looked down at the front row. Chloe sat paralyzed in her chair. The smug, entitled smirk she had worn all evening had vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, devastating humiliation. The man she was carrying a child for, the man who had bought her a luxury penthouse with stolen funds, had just publicly discarded her like garbage in front of 200 people to save his own skin. She wrapped her arms protectively around her stomach, shrinking into her champagne silk gown, as the church elders openly stared at her with deep, unfiltered judgment. The illusion that she was the incoming queen was shattered, leaving her exposed as nothing more than a temporary, expensive mistake. I gently but firmly pried DeAndre's trembling fingers off my arm. I stepped back, smoothing the fabric of my crimson gown, maintaining absolute, unwavering composure. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I just watched him drown in the shallow, pathetic pool of his own lies. But the spectacle was far from over. The Washington family dynamic dictated that when the golden child was cornered, the matriarch would attack. A sudden violent commotion erupted from the head table. Shirley pushed her chair back with such aggressive force that it toppled over, crashing loudly against the hardwood dance floor. She stormed toward the stage, her deep purple evening gown billowing behind her like a dark storm cloud. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, irrational fury. She bypassed the undeniable evidence of her son's theft and betrayal, completely ignoring the fact that Terrence was also implicated on the massive screen behind us. In Shirley's twisted, controlling mind, her sons could do no wrong, which meant the blame had to fall entirely on my shoulders. She marched up the carpeted stairs, her expensive heels stomping aggressively against the wood. She did not look at DeAndre. She marched straight up to me, snatching the microphone from the acrylic podium. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for the matriarch to speak, expecting her to disown the son who had humiliated their family name and dragged their reputation through the mud. Instead, Shirley pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. "You forced him to do this!" Shirley screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical, amplifying through the speakers and vibrating against the walls of the country club. "You drove my son into the arms of another woman. You could not give him a child. You care more about your selfish career than building a home." "Chloe is carrying his son." Shirley's desperate screams echoed across the quiet ballroom, a pathetic attempt to rewrite the narrative and protect her fragile social standing. She was willing to humiliate herself, defend a thief, and embrace a mistress just to avoid admitting that her golden boy was a fraud. "You pushed him away." Shirley continued to yell, her face shining with angry tears. "A real man needs a family, Nia. He needs a legacy. Since you refused to do your duty as a wife, he had to find a woman who would. Chloe is carrying his son, and that baby is a blessing to this family." I stood there under the blinding heat of the stage lights, absorbing the full weight of her delusional attack. 10 years of passive-aggressive comments, 10 years of thinly veiled insults about my ambition, all culminating in this exact moment of unhinged blame. She honestly believed that my dedication to my corporate auditing career justified her son embezzling federal funds and blowing our life savings on his pregnant girlfriend. She expected me to lower my head, accept the public shaming, and apologize for not being the submissive, accommodating incubator she always wanted me to be. I did not flinch. I did not argue back. The beautiful thing about financial audits and hard evidence is that they do not require emotional validation from toxic people. I let Shirley scream her defense of DeAndre's infidelity into the microphone, letting every single guest in the Piedmont Country Club witness the absolute moral bankruptcy of the Washington family matriarch. She was digging the grave deeper with every word she spoke, perfectly setting the stage for the final piece of evidence I had tucked away in my clutch. The crowd watched in stunned silence, completely paralyzed by the sheer dysfunction unfolding on stage. Pastor Williams shook his head in profound disappointment, quietly signaling to his wife that it was time to distance themselves from Shirley completely. DeAndre stood frozen behind his mother, breathing heavily, sweat dripping down his temples, foolishly hoping that Shirley's unhinged attack on my character would somehow distract the room from the federal crimes projected on the 20-foot screen behind us. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum, waiting for the first frame of the video to drop. The illusion of the perfect Washington family was currently suspended by a single fraying thread, and I had just taken a pair of sharp steel scissors directly to it. The show was finally starting. The massive digital projector mounted high above the ballroom flared to life. The heavy velvet curtains behind the stage parted automatically, revealing a massive theater-sized screen that spanned 20 feet across the wall. The bright white light of the projector cut through the dim ambiance of the country club, illuminating the shocked, expectant faces of the 200 guests. I stepped away from the podium and walked to the edge of the stage, standing directly above Chloe Jenkins. She was no longer smirking. Her hands had dropped from her stomach, and she was gripping the edges of the table, her knuckles turning white. Shirley was staring at the blank white screen, her brow furrowed in deep, sudden panic. Terrence had stopped networking, his glass of bourbon frozen halfway to his mouth. DeAndre stepped toward me, his voice a frantic, hushed whisper, meant only for my ears. "Nia, what is this? What video? Did you hire a videographer?" I did not look at him. I kept my eyes completely locked on the massive screen behind us. "Just watch the legacy you built, DeAndre," I whispered back, my voice colder than the ice sculpture melting in the center of the room. "Enjoy the premiere." The screen illuminated the dark ballroom with brutal, unforgiving clarity. The first image was not a carefully curated montage of our wedding day or a slideshow of our romantic vacations. It was the raw, unedited footage I had captured on my phone at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. The towering 20-foot display showed DeAndre wearing the exact same expensive sunglasses I had bought him, wrapping his arms around Chloe at the international check-in desk. The resolution was flawless. Every single detail of their betrayal was magnified for the entire room to witness. The camera zoomed in tight as DeAndre leaned down and passionately kissed my best friend. The crowd could see the unmistakable way her hands draped around his neck, displaying a level of comfort that only comes from months of deceit. The video then cut to the most damning angle of all. DeAndre sliding his hand down to rest squarely on Chloe's visibly rounded stomach, rubbing it with a sickeningly familiar affection while they laughed together. I had not stopped there. I am a financial auditor, and my presentations are always built on undeniable proof. The video dissolved from the airport footage into a stark, perfectly formatted presentation of hard financial data. Giant, crisp images of bank ledgers appeared on the screen, towering over the head table. The entire audience watched as the balance of our joint high-yield savings account was displayed, followed by the exact systematic withdrawals of $25,000 and $50,000. Bright red arrows, animated for dramatic effect, traced the stolen $200,000 directly into the corporate account of Apex Consulting Limited. Terrence's name was plastered across the screen in bold, undeniable letters as the registered agent of the shell company. The red arrows continued their relentless march across the screen, connecting Terrence's federal loan account to a wire transfer receipt. The final document faded into view, casting a bright white glow over the horrified guests. It was the official warranty deed for a luxury penthouse condo in the Buckhead district. The purchase price was highlighted in neon yellow, matching the exact amount stolen from my marital savings. And right there on the line, designating the sole owner of the property, was the name Chloe Jenkins. I had turned my financial audit into a public execution, complete with visual aids. The presentation looped, starting back at the airport kiss, ensuring that anyone who had blinked the first time would not miss a single frame of the betrayal. The reaction in the Piedmont Country Club was not just a gasp. It was a physical shockwave that rippled through the grand ballroom. 200 prominent guests, church elders, politicians, and business leaders inhaled sharply at the exact same moment. The silence that followed the initial gasp was deafening, a heavy, suffocating vacuum of absolute disbelief. Then the chaos erupted. The ambient jazz music had stopped entirely, the band members staring open-mouthed at the screen. Pastor Williams, the moral compass of Shirley's meticulously curated social circle, literally dropped his silver fork onto his china plate. The sharp clatter of metal against porcelain echoed loudly near the front table. DeAndre's fraternity brothers, who had just been cheering and raising their glasses to his supposed black excellence, suddenly found the floor incredibly interesting. Some shifted uncomfortably in their tailored suits, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The women from Shirley's church ministries began whispering frantically behind their hands, casting disgusted, horrified glances toward the front row where Chloe was sitting. Terrence stood frozen near the bar, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he realized his federal business account was being broadcast to the entire room. LaToya, who had been showing off her diamond tennis bracelet just moments before, accidentally dropped her wine glass, shattering it across the polished hardwood floor. The pristine, untouchable image of the Washington family empire was being dismantled brick by brick, broadcast in high definition for the entire city elite to consume. DeAndre stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his perfect, arrogant smile completely wiped from his face. The rich, warm tone of his skin drained away, leaving him looking hollow and terrified. He stared at the massive screen, watching himself kiss Chloe on a continuous loop. His brain struggled to process the reality that his secret life had just been weaponized against him by the very woman he thought he had successfully manipulated. When the shock finally wore off, sheer, unadulterated panic set in. He lunged toward the podium, his hands grasping wildly at the electronic controls, desperately trying to find a power button or a switch to shut off the projector. But the projector was mounted high in the vaulted ceiling of the ballroom, controlled exclusively by the remote resting securely in my hand. He could not reach it. He could not stop it. DeAndre whipped around to face me, his eyes wide with wild, unfiltered desperation. He abandoned all pretense of dignity, professionalism, and power. He rushed across the stage, grabbing my arm with trembling, sweaty hands. "Nia, turn this off," he pleaded, his voice cracking entirely, forgetting that his lapel microphone was still active and broadcasting his frantic begging to the entire room. "Nia, please, you have to shut it down. This is a misunderstanding. She means nothing to me." His words echoed through the massive speakers, carrying over the loud whispers of the crowd. "She means nothing to me, too." I looked down at the front row. Chloe sat paralyzed in her chair. The smug, entitled smirk she had worn all evening had vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, devastating humiliation. The man she was carrying a child for, the man who had bought her a luxury penthouse with stolen funds, had just publicly discarded her like garbage in front of 200 people to save his own skin. She wrapped her arms protectively around her stomach, shrinking into her champagne silk gown as the church elders openly stared at her with deep, unfiltered judgment. The illusion that she was the incoming queen was shattered, leaving her exposed as nothing more than a temporary, expensive mistake. I gently but firmly pried DeAndre's trembling fingers off my arm. I stepped back, smoothing the fabric of my crimson gown, maintaining absolute, unwavering composure. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I just watched him drown in the shallow, pathetic pool of his own lies. But the spectacle was far from over. The Washington family dynamic dictated that when the golden child was cornered, the matriarch would attack. A sudden violent commotion erupted from the head table. Shirley pushed her chair back with such aggressive force that it toppled over, crashing loudly against the hardwood dance floor. She stormed toward the stage, her deep purple evening gown billowing behind her like a dark storm cloud. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, irrational fury. She bypassed the undeniable evidence of her son's theft and betrayal, completely ignoring the fact that Terrence was also implicated on the massive screen behind us. In Shirley's twisted, controlling mind, her sons could do no wrong, which meant the blame had to fall entirely on my shoulders. She marched up the carpeted stairs, her expensive heels stomping aggressively against the wood. She did not look at DeAndre. She marched straight up to me, snatching the microphone from the acrylic podium. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for the matriarch to speak, expecting her to disown the son who had humiliated their family name and dragged their reputation through the mud. Instead, Shirley pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. "You forced him to do this!" Shirley screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical, amplifying through the speakers and vibrating against the walls of the country club. "You drove my son into the arms of another woman. You could not give him a child. You care more about your selfish career than building a home. Chloe is carrying his son. Shirley's desperate screams echoed across the quiet ballroom, a pathetic attempt to rewrite the narrative and protect her fragile social standing. She was willing to humiliate herself, defend a thief, and embrace a mistress, just to avoid admitting that her golden boy was a fraud. You pushed him away. Shirley continued to yell, her face shining with angry tears. A real man needs a family, Nia. He needs a legacy. Since you refused to do your duty as a wife, he had to find a woman who would. Chloe is carrying his son, and that baby is a blessing to this family. I stood there under the blinding heat of the stage lights, absorbing the full weight of her delusional attack. 10 years of passive-aggressive comments, 10 years of thinly veiled insults about my ambition, all culminating in this exact moment of unhinged blame. She honestly believed that my dedication to my corporate auditing career justified her son embezzling federal funds and blowing our life savings on his pregnant girlfriend. She expected me to lower my head, accept the public shaming, and apologize for not being the submissive, accommodating incubator she always wanted me to be. I did not flinch. I did not argue back. The beautiful thing about financial audits and hard evidence is that they do not require emotional validation from toxic people. I let Shirley scream her defense of DeAndre's infidelity into the microphone, letting every single guest in the Piedmont Country Club witness the absolute moral bankruptcy of the Washington family matriarch. She was digging the grave deeper with every word she spoke, perfectly setting the stage for the final piece of evidence I had tucked away in my clutch. The crowd watched in stunned silence, completely paralyzed by the sheer dysfunction unfolding on stage. Pastor Williams shook his head in profound disappointment, quietly signaling to his wife that it was time to distance themselves from Shirley completely. DeAndre stood frozen behind his mother, breathing heavily, sweat dripping down his temples, foolishly hoping that Shirley's unhinged attack on my character would somehow distract the room from the federal crimes projected on the 20-foot screen behind us. I slowly unclasped my crimson clutch and pulled out a single, heavily redacted medical file. I held it up, making sure the entire ballroom could see the official hospital seal stamped on the front cover. I calmly walked over to Shirley and gently took the microphone from her trembling hand. A son. I asked, my voice echoing through the massive speakers, calm, steady, and utterly lethal. That is a fascinating theory, Shirley. Truly it is. But there is a massive biological flaw in your narrative. I pressed a button on the remote control. The video of the airport kiss vanished from the massive projector screen. In its place, a high-definition image of a medical diagnostic report appeared, towering 20 feet high for everyone to see. The document was clearly labeled with DeAndre's full name, his date of birth, and the official letterhead of a prominent Atlanta fertility clinic. I had highlighted the final diagnostic conclusion in bright neon yellow. I turned to look at Shirley, who was staring at the massive screen, her brow furrowed in confusion. Because this medical report from 3 years ago proves that your son DeAndre is 100% sterile, I announced, my voice carrying to the very back of the ballroom. He has severe, untreatable azoospermia. He has known for years, Shirley. He was just too embarrassed, too obsessed with his image of perfect black masculinity to tell you the truth. He let you blame my career for our empty nursery for 3 years because he was too much of a coward to admit his own biological failure. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that rings in your ears. 200 people held their breath simultaneously. The church elders stared at the screen, reading the medical diagnosis for themselves. Shirley's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her looking fragile and suddenly very old. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to grip the acrylic podium to keep from collapsing onto the stage. The grand illusion of her son's flawless masculinity had just been publicly obliterated. DeAndre froze completely. His chest stopped heaving. His eyes were wide, fixed on the massive medical report projected behind us. The reality of the document slowly penetrated his panic. He had hidden this secret from his mother, from his fraternity brothers, from his entire community, terrified of being seen as less of a man. And now, the entire country club was staring at the undeniable proof of his sterility. But the true devastation was not just the exposure of his medical condition. The implication of the document hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The math simply did not add up. DeAndre slowly, mechanically turned his head to look down at the front row. He looked at Chloe, who was sitting frozen in her chair, her hands clutching her champagne silk gown. The smug arrogance was completely gone, replaced by sheer unadulterated terror. I leaned into the microphone, my voice a soft, dangerous whisper that amplified perfectly through the silent ballroom. "If DeAndre is sterile, Chloe," I asked, letting the question hang suspended over the crowd. "Whose baby are you carrying?" Chloe sat absolutely paralyzed. The vibrant color had completely drained from her face, leaving her foundation looking like a chalky mask against her suddenly ashen skin. She opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords refused to cooperate. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. The sheer panic in her eyes was a masterpiece to behold. She had built her entire future on the foundation of a stolen husband and a stolen bank account, and the architect of her destruction was standing on a stage holding a medical file that proved she was nothing but a common fraud. DeAndre stood frozen behind me on the stage, the reality of the medical document crashing through his inflated ego like a wrecking ball. The arrogant commercial real estate king, the man who had just spent 10 minutes boasting about his legacy and his bloodline, finally processed the devastating truth. The child he had embezzled federal funds to support, the baby he had thrown away his marriage to claim, did not belong to him. His chest began to heave rapidly, the heavy breathing of a man who suddenly realized he was suffocating in his own lies. He looked from the massive projection screen down to the front row, his eyes locking onto Chloe's terrified face. He did not walk down the carpeted stairs. He leaped off the edge of the stage, his polished dress shoes hitting the hardwood floor with a violent thud. The sudden aggressive movement sent a wave of panic through the front tables. The elite guests, the church elders, and the fraternity brothers scrambled backward, pulling their chairs away from the impending collision. DeAndre lunged across the short distance between the stage and the VIP table, his hands slamming down hard onto the white silk tablecloth directly in front of Chloe. The crystal water glasses tipped over, shattering against the floor, but DeAndre did not even blink. "Who is it?" he roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of profound heartbreak and absolute rage. The carefully crafted public image of the composed, successful black businessman was completely gone. He was leaning over her, his face inches from hers, veins bulging visibly against the sides of his neck. Chloe shrank back into her chair, pressing her shoulders against the velvet upholstery as if trying to merge with the furniture. "I asked you a question, Chloe," DeAndre screamed, his voice echoing violently through the silent ballroom. "You let me buy you a penthouse. You let me throw away my entire marriage for a son. Tell me right now, whose baby are you carrying?" Chloe's composure shattered completely. The smug, entitled mistress vanished, replaced by a sobbing, cornered manipulator who had run out of lies. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup, carrying dark streaks of mascara down her cheeks. She raised her trembling hands protectively over her stomach, shaking her head back and forth as if trying to deny the reality of the situation. DeAndre slammed his fist against the table again, the sharp crack making her flinch violently. "Tell me," he demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous, threatening register. "It is—" Marcus, Chloe sobbed, the confession ripping out of her throat between heavy, panicked gasps. The microphone picked up her frantic breathing. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look at the man she had conned. "He is my personal trainer. We have been seeing each other since last summer at the gym. He is only 23, DeAndre. He works at the front desk and trains clients on the side. He does not have anything. He lives with 4 roommates in a tiny apartment. When I found out I was pregnant, I panicked. I knew Marcus could not provide the lifestyle I needed. But you were always complaining about Nia working too much, always talking about how desperately you wanted a son to carry on your name. You made it so easy. You were so desperate to be a father that you never even asked for a paternity test. You just handed me the world." The collective gasp from the ballroom was even louder than the first. A 23-year-old personal trainer. My husband, the brilliant real estate mogul who thought he was outsmarting his financial auditor wife, had bankrolled a luxury penthouse for a broke gym employee's child. The sheer magnitude of the hustle was almost impressive if it had not been funded by my stolen money. A piercing, hysterical shriek tore through the ballroom. Shirley collapsed backward into her chair, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically shot by a sniper. The matriarch, who had just spent the last 5 minutes publicly defending her son's infidelity, the woman who had proudly commanded Latoya to paint the nursery sage green for the new heir to the Washington Empire, was now gasping for air. Her expensive fascinator hat sat crookedly on her head, her pristine church image absolutely decimated. My baby Shirley wailed, rocking back and forth in her chair, completely ignoring the fact that her son was a federal criminal. My legacy. You lied to us, you wicked girl. You brought a stranger's child into this family. The humiliation was too much for the Washington family to bear, and their default response to humiliation was aggressive deflection. Latoya and Terrence rushed forward, completely ignoring DeAndre's meltdown and Chloe's sobbing confession. They scrambled to control the narrative, desperately trying to salvage whatever scrap of dignity remained in front of their wealthy peers. Latoya pointed a shaking finger at me, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light from the chandeliers. "This is your fault!" Latoya screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "You planned this whole spectacle just to embarrass us. You could have handled this at home like a real wife. But you had to drag the entire community into it. You are a bitter, spiteful woman, Nia." Terrence stepped in front of his wife, puffing out his chest, desperately attempting to assert his fading authority over a situation that had already spiraled wildly out of his control. The man who had used federal grant money to launder his brother's stolen assets was now trying to play the role of the protective patriarch. He marched up to the edge of the stage, glaring up at me with open hostility. "Turn off that screen right now," Terrence commanded, jabbing his finger toward the massive projector displaying his own federal crimes. "You are out of your mind if you think you can humiliate this family and just walk away. You are done, Nia. Do you hear me? You are completely out of the family. When this party is over, we are going straight to your house, and we are kicking you out onto the street tonight. You are leaving with nothing but the clothes on your back." I stood at the edge of the stage, looking down at my brother-in-law with absolute disgust. The man was threatening to evict me from a house he did not own, using authority he did not possess, while actively standing in the crosshairs of a federal investigation. The absolute delusion of the Washington family was a bottomless pit. I threw my head back and laughed. It was not a chuckle or a polite giggle. It was a cold, sharp, resonant sound that sliced straight through the tension in the ballroom. The sound of my laughter echoed through the microphone, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and freezing Terrence in his tracks. Latoya stopped yelling. Shirley stopped wailing. Even DeAndre turned around, staring up at me with bloodshot, terrified eyes. "Kick me out," I asked, leaning down toward the microphone, my voice dripping with lethal amusement. "Terrence, you cannot kick anyone out of anywhere. You lease your car, you lease your furniture, and you are currently standing here threatening me, while you do not even own the suit you are wearing. Your entire life is a subsidized rental agreement funded by my hard work." The crowd murmured, the high society guests, whispering behind their hands, as the facade of the successful Washington brothers crumbled into pathetic dust. Terrence's face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. He opened his mouth to shout another empty threat, desperate to reclaim his shattered pride, but the words died instantly in his throat. Before he could take another breath, a heavy, synchronized metallic thud echoed from the very back of the room. Every single head in the Piedmont Country Club turned simultaneously. The heavy brass doors to the banquet hall swung wide open, slamming against the marble walls with a deafening crash that silenced the entire room. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath as the heavy brass doors hit the marble walls. The grand entrance was not subtle. It was designed to shatter whatever remained of the Washington family's composure. Elias Thorne stepped into the room, his charcoal gray suit perfectly tailored, his expression completely devoid of emotion. He did not look like a guest who had arrived late to a celebration. He looked like the Grim Reaper arriving to collect a debt. Flanking Elias on either side were two men wearing dark suits, their posture rigid, their faces completely impassive. They moved with the unmistakable authoritative presence of federal law enforcement. The jazz band had long since stopped playing, and the only sound in the massive country club ballroom was the synchronized, heavy footsteps of the three men walking purposefully down the center aisle. The crowd parted instantly, practically throwing themselves out of the way to avoid being associated with whatever was about to happen. Shirley's shrieks died in her throat. She stared at Elias and the two men, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Terrence's bravado vanished completely. He stepped back from the edge of the stage, his eyes darting frantically toward the emergency exits. DeAndre stood paralyzed, his gaze locked on the federal agents marching directly toward his table. Elias stopped at the base of the stage, looking up at me. He gave a single sharp nod. The perimeter was secured, the trap was sprung. I leaned back into the microphone, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the cold, hard weight of absolute certainty. "Terrence DeAndre," I said, addressing my husband and my brother-in-law, whose faces had both drained of all color. "Did you really think you could use Federal Small Business Administration loans to wash stolen money and buy private real estate in Buckhead? Did you honestly believe that funneling government grant money across international borders to fund a romantic getaway in Paris was just a harmless accounting error?" The murmurs in the crowd escalated into loud, shocked whispers. Pastor Williams looked physically ill, stepping further away from the head table as if the Washington family had suddenly become radioactive. The elite guests, the politicians, and the business leaders were staring at DeAndre and Terrence with absolute horror. "That is not just marital infidelity," I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly through the speakers. "That is a direct violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 1343. That is federal wire fraud. It is embezzlement of government funds, and the IRS and the FBI do not play games with men who use minority community development grants to buy luxury penthouses for their pregnant mistresses." The two federal agents stepped forward, pulling their badges from their suit jackets. DeAndre Washington and Terrence Washington, the lead agent, announced, his voice booming with undeniable authority. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering." DeAndre staggered backward, shaking his head wildly. "No, wait, please. This is a mistake," he yelled, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He looked desperately at Terrence, searching for his older brother to fix the situation, to throw some money at the problem, to talk their way out of it like they always did. But Terrence was completely silent, his hands raised in surrender, staring at the floor in utter defeat. The agents moved swiftly. One agent grabbed DeAndre's arm, twisting it forcefully behind his back, while the other secured Terrence. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly through the ballroom. The sound was brutal, final, and absolutely satisfying. DeAndre struggled against the restraints, crying openly, his carefully manicured public image completely destroyed. "Nia, please, tell them it's a mistake," he sobbed, looking up at me on the stage. "I'll sign whatever you want. I'll give you the house. Just please stop this." I looked down at the man I had loved for 10 years. The man who had stolen my money, betrayed my trust, and mocked my career. I did not feel an ounce of pity. "The house," I replied, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "DeAndre, you signed away your equity in the house last week when I made you the primary signatory on that new wealth fund. And by signing that document, you also took sole legal liability for the fraudulent SBA loan. You handed me the keys to your own jail cell, and I simply locked the door." Shirley let out a guttural, agonizing wail. She collapsed back into her overturned chair, sobbing hysterically as she watched her two golden boys being manhandled by federal agents. The matriarch, who had spent the entire evening bragging about her family's legacy, who had publicly blamed my ambition for her son's cheating, was now watching her entire empire burn to the ground. "My boys," she screamed, clutching at her chest. "Lord have mercy, my boys." LaToya, realizing that her husband's federal arrest meant the end of her least luxury lifestyle, burst into frantic tears. She grabbed Terrence's arm as the agent pulled him away. "Terrence, what did you do?" LaToya shrieked, her expensive makeup running down her face. "How are we going to pay for my car? What about my credit cards, Terrence?" Terrence ignored his wife, keeping his head down as the agent marched him toward the exit. The high society guests were pulling out their phones, snapping photos, and recording videos of the arrests. The very people Shirley had invited to witness her family's excellence were now documenting their spectacular criminal downfall. The Washington family was becoming a viral spectacle, their humiliation immortalized on the internet before the night was even over. I stood on the stage watching the chaos unfold with absolute cold detachment. The federal agents escorted DeAndre and Terrence down the center aisle, marching them past the shocked faces of their fraternity brothers and the disgusted stares of their church community. The public humiliation was absolute. There was no spinning this. There was no deflecting the blame. They had been caught red-handed, and their punishment was being broadcast live to the very people they cared about impressing the most. As the heavy brass doors swung shut behind the federal agents and the two handcuffed brothers, the ballroom fell into a stunned, heavy silence. The only sounds were Shirley's hysterical sobbing and Chloe's quiet, terrified gasps. The illusion of the perfect Washington family was completely shattered, leaving nothing but the pathetic criminal reality behind. Elias stepped up to the edge of the stage, looking up at me. He did not smile, but I could see the professional satisfaction in his eyes. The operation was a complete success. The trap had worked flawlessly. I turned my attention back to the front row. Chloe was sitting frozen in her chair, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear, completely isolated and utterly vulnerable. The man who was supposed to provide for her was on his way to federal prison. The family who was supposed to welcome her as their new queen was in absolute ruins. She was completely alone. I picked up the microphone one last time. I was not finished. The checkmate was not complete until every single piece was removed from the board. The heavy brass doors were still swinging violently from the force of the federal agents exiting with Terrence. DeAndre was actively dragging his feet across the polished marble floor of the foyer, his expensive tailored suit bunching awkwardly around the steel federal handcuffs, binding his wrists behind his back. The second agent shoved him forward, but DeAndre twisted his entire body around, digging the heels of his custom leather shoes deep into the thick, luxurious carpet of the country club. He looked back at the illuminated stage, his face a terrifying mask of sweat, running tears, and utter helpless desperation. "Nia, please!" DeAndre screamed, his voice raw, frantic, and echoing through the cavernous, silent space of the ballroom. "Do not let them take everything. The house. Keep the house safe. You have the trust documents. Protect our home. Do not let the feds seize the house, Nia." He was genuinely begging. In his twisted, arrogant, deeply delusional mind, he still believed I was his ultimate safety net. He actually thought that the offshore blind trust I had him sign was a mutual protection protocol, a shrewd business move engineered by his brilliant wife to shield our marital assets from the government. He honestly believed I was going to wait for him, hold down his fortress, manage his accounts, and play the fiercely loyal, submissive wife while he served his federal sentence. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his delusion was almost beautiful to witness. I lifted the microphone back to my lips. My voice cut through the stifling, horrified silence of the grand ballroom with absolute surgical precision. "The house," I asked, allowing a cool, razor-sharp, victorious smile to spread across my face. "DeAndre, you really should have read page 42 of that commercial syndicate agreement before you eagerly signed it. You did not just transfer the house into a protective blind trust. You gave me sole, uncontested legal authority to liquidate the property entirely." DeAndre stopped struggling against the grip of the federal agent. His mouth dropped open, the blood completely drained from his face as the reality of his monumental stupidity finally clicked into place. "I sold the house, DeAndre." I announced my words ringing out like gunshots through the premium sound system. "I sold it 30 days ago to a massive commercial developer who specializes in tearing down residential properties to build high-end strip malls. The sale cleared escrow yesterday morning. The money is currently sitting securely in a private, offshore account that neither you nor the federal government can ever touch. You do not own a home anymore." The second federal agent gave DeAndre a hard, unforgiving shove, forcing him forcefully through the exterior doorway. DeAndre's final agonizing scream of pure defeat was cut off abruptly as the heavy brass doors slammed shut, sealing him outside in the cold, harsh reality of his new criminal life. I turned my gaze down from the doorway and focused directly on the front row. Shirley was clutching her chest, gasping for air, like a fish thrown violently onto dry land. Beside her, Latoya was furiously typing on her phone, her hands shaking so violently she kept dropping the device onto the silk tablecloth. And speaking of the house, I continued making sure my voice carried directly to the matriarch's table, pinning them in place. Shirley, Latoya, since you both practically moved in to help plan this spectacular anniversary gala, I assume most of your expensive clothes, your luxury shoes, and your precious jewelry are still sitting in my guest bedrooms. You better leave this party right now and go pack your bags. Shirley looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock and sudden paralyzing fear. The new commercial developers are arriving with a demolition crew to change all the locks at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I stated my tone, offering zero room for negotiation. If you are still inside that property when the contractors arrive, the local police will be called, and you will be arrested for criminal trespassing. I suggest you call an Uber immediately. Your reign over my dining room is officially over. Shirley let out a choked, sputtering, miserable sob. The woman who had proudly declared that my corporate career made me a failure as a wife, the woman who had openly cheered for my husband's pregnant mistress, was now effectively homeless and entirely destitute. Latoya grabbed Shirley by the arm, hauling her mother-in-law out of her overturned chair with frantic urgency. They did not look back. They pulled each other toward the side exit, keeping their heads down to escape the hundreds of judging, disgusted eyes burning into their backs. With the Washington family matriarch fleeing the scene in absolute disgrace, I slowly walked from the center of the stage to the very edge. I looked directly down at Chloe. She was huddled in her chair, shivering uncontrollably despite the warm, comfortable temperature of the elegant ballroom. Her champagne silk dress, carefully chosen to highlight her pregnancy and assert her dominance over my life, now just looked incredibly pathetic. She was gripping her stomach tightly, looking up at me with large, terrified, tear-filled eyes. She had lost her wealthy lover. She had lost her high society future. But she still thought she had her luxury real estate. She still thought she had secured her financial bag. And Chloe, I said, my voice dropping to a conversational, intimate volume that somehow sounded even more terrifying through the massive room speakers. Chloe flinched visibly, shrinking back deep into the velvet upholstery of her chair. Did you really think I would let you keep the penthouse? I asked, tilting my head slightly, observing her like a predator studying a cornered mouse. Did you honestly believe you could sleep with my husband, mock me in my own home, lie to my face about a detox, and walk away with a luxury Buckhead condo funded exclusively by my corporate bonuses? Chloe opened her mouth to speak, to beg, to offer some pathetic excuse, but only a breathless, terrified squeak came out of her throat. The Internal Revenue Service seized that property at 6 o'clock this morning, I revealed, watching the absolute final shred of hope drain completely out of her face. Because it was purchased directly with embezzled federal grant money, the government did not even need a lengthy trial to execute an emergency civil asset forfeiture. The federal marshals have already changed the keypad codes on the front door. Your designer clothes, your expensive shoes, and that beautiful sage green nursery furniture Latoya was so excited to buy, it all belongs to the federal government now. Chloe covered her face with her hands, letting out a loud, miserable, soul-crushing wail. She was completely broken. Her entire grift had collapsed, burying her under the rubble. And those overseas bank accounts DeAndre set up for your little Parisian getaway, I added, turning the knife one last glorious time. Frozen. Every single penny is locked down in an international federal evidence file. You have absolutely nothing left, Chloe. You burned a 10-year friendship and destroyed a marriage just to end up broke, publicly humiliated, and facing a massive federal tax audit of your own. I stared down at her, feeling absolutely no remorse, no guilt, and no sympathy. Enjoy raising Marcus's baby in a cheap motel. I hear the personal training business is really lucrative this time of year. Chloe pushed herself up from the table, covering her ruined, tear-stained face with her clutch, and ran sobbing down the center aisle. She pushed past the church elders and the wealthy developers, fleeing the country club in absolute undeniable disgrace. I stood tall on the stage and looked out over the grand ballroom. The room was in complete and utter ruins. The psychological devastation was absolute. The untouchable matriarch's pride was shattered into a million irreversible pieces. The golden boy was currently sitting in the back of a federal vehicle in steel handcuffs. The loud, arrogant brother-in-law was facing a decade in a federal penitentiary. And the snake masquerading as a best friend was homeless, broke, and publicly exposed. The 200 guests were completely paralyzed. The city councilmen, the wealthy investors, the fraternity brothers, and the church committee members were all staring at me with a complex mixture of profound shock, awe, and deep instinctual fear. They had come to this country club to celebrate a decade of Black excellence, and instead they had witnessed a masterful, perfectly executed, utterly ruthless financial slaughter. I walked down the short flight of carpeted stairs, my crimson gown sweeping elegantly behind me on the polished wood. The crowd parted automatically, stepping back hastily to give me a wide, respectful berth. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody dared to pull out their phone. Nobody dared to offer an opinion. They just watched me move through the silent, glittering room with my head held incredibly high. I stopped directly in front of the head table. Pastor Williams was standing there, his face pale, his hands nervously clutching his leather-bound Bible. The man who had frequently preached to me about the virtues of a quiet, forgiving, submissive wife looked absolutely terrified of the woman standing before him. I held out the microphone. Pastor Williams stared at it for a long, heavy second before slowly raising his trembling hand to take it from my grasp. I looked around the lavishly decorated ballroom, taking in the crystal chandeliers, the melting swan ice sculpture, and the 50 tables covered in incredibly expensive, untouched, catered food. "Enjoy the buffet, everyone," I said, my voice completely calm, pleasant, and utterly victorious. "It is paid for." I turned my back on the silent, paralyzed ballroom and walked away. I did not rush. My pace was measured, unhurried, and perfectly poised. My crimson gown glided across the polished marble floor of the country club foyer as I left the wreckage of the Washington family empire permanently behind me. The heavy glass exit doors parted smoothly, and I stepped out into the cool, crisp Atlanta night air. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with an intoxicating sense of absolute freedom. I did not shed a single tear. I did not look over my shoulder. There was nothing left in that building worth looking back at. A sleek black town car was idling at the edge of the valet roundabout. Elias Thorne stood by the open rear door, his hands resting comfortably in his pockets. He offered a sharp, respectful nod as I approached. We did not need to exchange words. The flawless execution of the evening spoke for itself. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat, and Elias closed the door with a solid, satisfying thud, shutting out the chaos forever. The aftermath unfolded exactly as Elias had predicted, a swift and brutal sequence of federal justice and absolute social ruin. DeAndre and Terrence were denied bail. The federal judge deemed them a flight risk due to the international wire transfers to Paris. They traded their tailored Italian suits and flashy gold watches for standard-issue orange jumpsuits at the federal detention center. The grand jury indictment came down hard and fast. They were officially charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and embezzlement of federal funds. Facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in federal prison, the arrogant swagger was completely beaten out of them. DeAndre attempted to call me collect from the facility exactly once. I listened to the automated voice operator announce his name, smiled quietly to myself, and permanently blocked the number. Shirley and LaToya met a similarly devastating fate. At exactly 8 o'clock the morning after the gala, the commercial developer's demolition crew arrived at my former marital home. True to my word, the local police escorted Shirley and LaToya off the property. They stood on the sidewalk, surrounded by a chaotic pile of hastily packed garbage bags, watching as contractors immediately changed the locks and began stripping the house. Without my corporate income to fund their luxurious lifestyle, the two women were forced to sign a lease on a cramped, dingy 2-bedroom apartment in a rough neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The social fallout was absolute. Pastor Williams and the church elders swiftly and publicly distanced themselves from the Washington family. Shirley, who had spent decades reigning over the congregation and judging other women, found herself completely shunned. When she showed up for Sunday service, nobody would sit in the same pew as her. Her phone calls went entirely unanswered. The flawless image of black excellence she had worshipped above basic human decency was dead and buried. Latoya was forced to return her leased luxury SUV and take a minimum wage job as a receptionist just to keep the lights on in their miserable new apartment. And Chloe Jenkins learned the harshest lesson of all. The IRS Asset Forfeiture Unit moved with terrifying speed, officially seizing the Buckhead penthouse and everything inside it. Homeless, disgraced, and heavily pregnant, she desperately tried to fall back on her young personal trainer. But the moment Marcus realized Chloe had no money, no luxury condo, and was currently embroiled in a massive federal fraud investigation, he immediately blocked her number and quit his job at the gym. Chloe ended up living out of a cheap, run-down weekly motel off the interstate. She was completely broke, utterly alone, and facing intense scrutiny from federal tax investigators who wanted to know exactly how much she knew about the stolen SBA loan money. They had all conspired to drain my resources and tear me down. Now they were left with absolutely nothing but the ashes of their own greed. 30 days later, I found myself walking through the international terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta Airport. It was the exact same terminal where the illusion of my marriage had shattered just weeks ago. But this time, I was not hiding behind a concrete pillar. I was walking straight toward the first-class departure gate. I handed my boarding pass to the airline attendant and stepped onto the plane. The flight attendant greeted me by name and escorted me to my private lie-flat suite in the first-class cabin. I settled into the plush leather seat, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of peace settle over my entire body. I opened my laptop, glancing briefly at the thriving, expanding portfolios of my offshore trusts and independent wealth funds. Everything was secure. My empire was impenetrable. The flight attendant returned a moment later, offering me a crystal flute filled with chilled vintage champagne. I accepted the glass with a polite smile and turned my attention to the window. The massive jet engines roared to life, pushing the plane down the runway until the wheels finally left the tarmac. I watched the sprawling city of Atlanta shrink beneath me, leaving behind the toxic, leeching family that had tried and spectacularly failed to destroy me. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the crisp champagne as the plane broke through the cloud cover, ascending into the bright, limitless blue sky. They thought my value was tied to my utility. They thought my quiet dedication was a sign of weakness. They severely miscalculated. I had lost a fraudulent husband, a manipulative best friend, and a parasitic family, but I had gained the entire world. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes, letting the quiet hum of the aircraft carry me toward Monaco. I realized then that the ultimate sweet revenge is not just the total destruction of your enemies. The ultimate sweet revenge is absolute uninterrupted peace.